Okay, let's get into this week's deep dive. You shared a really fascinating transcript. It's from the Telegraph's podcast, Afamarin, and just packed, absolutely packed with political news from The Hague.
hmm It really is. A lot going on there.
Yeah. So our job today really is to pull out the most important bits from their discussion. It was pretty rapid fire, covering Stickstoff nitrogen pensions, the coalition's health, even a politician's trip.
It's quite the mix. Stickstoff, pensions, budget talks, all the big ones.
Exactly. It's a lot, but we'll try and make sense of it all together so you, the listener, come away feeling informed, not, overwhelmed.
Absolutely. That Avhammerin podcast, it's a good snapshot of the pressures right now. It's interesting how these different issues kind of bump up against each other.
Right. So let's start with stick stuff. It's urgent. The podcast really highlighted the ongoing struggle with the Radvan State, Council of State, the rulings.
Yeah, that's a constant theme, isn't it?
It is. And the potential need for huge sums of money. They were talking possibly around 15 billion euros, again, sort of echoing those previous figures.
That number just keeps reappearing. 15 billion. It's substantial.
It really is. What seemed to surprise the hosts, and me too, actually, was the Prime Minister recently coming out quite strongly, acknowledging how serious the issue is.
The timing of that.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? With these court rulings demanding action for a while now, why wasn't this, hammered out more seriously during the formation talks?
That's a really sharp point. The podcast kind of implicitly asks that
Hmm.
about political priorities. It feels like maybe the urgency only really hit home after the latest Radvan State decision.
Could be. Like it forced their hand.
Yeah, perhaps a disconnect between the long-term legal stuff and the immediate political deal-making during the formation. The specific rulings might have just created this unavoidable pressure point.
Exactly. Okay. And here's where it gets really interesting, especially for listeners following the BBB party. The podcast got into their initial stance on stick stuff.
Ah, yes, their position has been key.
Remember, they were strongly against the last cabinet's ideas, like have your defeat staple, cutting livestock numbers in half. Big opposition there.
Very strong opposition. They
Yeah.
focus more on measuring actual deposition, looking beyond just farming.
Right. But now the podcast suggests there's been a bit of a shift within the BBB. They seem to be realizing they need to, deliver some less pleasant news to farmers.
A change in tone.
Sort of. They're using words like drang, which is like pressure, instead of dwang, which is more like coercion. Trying to encourage changes near vulnerable nature areas, the Velue, the Peel,
Right.
maybe using zoning, compensation.
That shift in language is telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows the difficulty when you move from campaigning to actually governing.
Yeah.
You hit the reality of laws, court rulings.
You have to adapt.
You do. And while drang sounds softer than dwang, the basic need for pretty big changes in land use, in farming practices in those sensitive zones, well, that seems to remain.
Precisely. But, the hosts on Ephemeron, they sounded pretty skeptical about whether the BBB's approach is really that different from the previous government's.
Skepticism, okay. Why?
Well, they pointed out that, look, whichever way you frame it, it's going to cost a lot of money. Serious funding. And it still means foreigners in certain areas will have to change how they use their land.
So the core challenge, the money and the land use, it's still there regardless of the party.
Seems like it. And they also brought up Rob Jetton's past comments, remember, when he talked quite firmly about having livestock numbers.
Bringing up old battle.
Yeah, suggesting those old, really divisive debates might just come bubbling back up, even with the BBB trying for this, more inclusive way forward. History casting a shadow, maybe?
That skepticism makes sense. It's hard for any new party, really, to turn campaign promises into policy that works on the ground and satisfies everyone. The money issue alone shows the constraints are pretty similar.
And mentioning Jetton just reminds you how deep the divisions on this go.
Definitely. It's got a long history.
And the podcast didn't just stop at farming. They touched on other potential measures for stick stuff, like lowering speed limits near Natura 2000 areas.
Oh, right. Affecting drivers, too.
Exactly. That's significant because it shows it's not just an agricultural problem. It could hit everyone driving near those zones, whatever car they have.
Broadens the impact considerably.
It does. And the hosts were reflecting on what a tough spot the BBB's Minister of Agriculture is in. They're bound to make decisions that upset some of their own base, right?
An unenviable position, for sure.
Yeah.
Balancing regulations, court demands, voter expectations.
Yeah, and they even contrast it, saying, imagine if a different coalition was in power, maybe pushing for even tougher measures. It just highlights how complex it is. No easy wins for anyone.
No. It really is a political tightrope for the whole coalition. The ag minister has that direct pressure from farmers, but measures like speed limits show it ripples out much wider.
So the big question is, will whatever package they come up with actually satisfy the courts and feel like a genuinely different approach?
That's the multi-billion-euro question, isn't it?
Yeah, effective
This
too.
versus political stability.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Next up, the coalition's internal dynamics. The podcast really shone a light on some tensions.
The internal workings. Always interesting.
Specifically, this disagreement over pensions. It involved the Minister of Social Affairs, Van Hyjem, who's from NSC, and then NSC itself and the BBB. They're clashing over a possible referendum on the new pension system.
Right, the referendum idea. That's been bubbling up.
And it's clearly sensitive. The podcast played audio of Van Hyjem sounding really annoyed about leaks to the press about this fight. He sounded genuinely frustrated, even hinted at legal action.
Wow, okay. So, public frustration from a minister. That signals real friction behind the scenes.
Definitely painted that picture.
And it's fascinating when you think about the background of these new pension rules. The host reminded us, didn't they? This wasn't cooked up overnight.
No, far from it.
Years of talks. Social partners unions, employers hammering it out, long debates in parliament, votes. It was a whole process.
A very long democratic process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Aimed at making pensions sustainable, balancing needs across generations. So for Peter Omsik's NSC to suddenly push for a referendum quite late in the day.
After the coalition deal was basically done?
Yeah, you can see why that would cause friction with the other partners who'd already signed off on the reforms. A lot of political capital spent.
Right. And the Ephemeron hosts tried to figure out NSC's motives. They suggested maybe it's a way to grab the spotlight again.
Regain prominence, maybe.
Because the coalition talks didn't fully deliver on their big promise of Bestand-Zekerheid security of existence. And they pointed out Omsik is good at tapping into public unease.
Especially around money issues.
Exactly. Pensions feel very personal, your money. So the idea of having a direct, say, a referendum might resonate, even if the experts are doubtful.
And the Rodvan state advice was negative, wasn't it?
Yeah.
On the referendum itself.
Strongly negative, which adds another layer. NSC seems to be pushing something the top legal advisors have serious doubts about.
That's interesting. The podcast picked up on a potential inconsistency there, didn't they?
Yeah.
How NSC uses the Rodvan state's advice.
Yeah, they seem to suggest NSC values the council's opinion highly when it suits them, like maybe on asylum policy.
But perhaps less so when the advice goes against their plan, like with this pension referendum.
Exactly. Kind of a selective approach. Raises questions, you know. And they also touched on internal NSC, an awkward situation with the state secretary for finance.
And Van Hyjem, the minister, may be owing a political debt to Omthik.
Yeah, making him potentially caught between his job as minister and his party leader's agenda on this. It sounds complicated.
Very tangled. Ministerial responsibility versus party loyalty. Classic coalition tension.
Okay. Then the conversation moved to the Voorjaarsnota, the spring budget memorandum, and the country's finances.
The money talk, always crucial.
And Wilders, from the PVV, he's apparently already maneuvering, trying to lock in benefits for his voters, saying people need enough cash for essentials, but also, you know, for leisure.
Sitting out his stall early.
Yeah.
Demanding spending.
Pretty much. Which immediately suggests potential clashes ahead, right? Because economists are reportedly questioning if now's the time for big spending increases.
Fiscal prudence versus popular demands. That's the tightrope for the finance minister.
Definitely. And the podcast drew some interesting parallels to the past. They reminded listeners how Wilders often starts with strong demands.
But might compromise later. That's his pattern sometimes.
But they also recalled the collapse of the Rudai cabinet. PVV pulled out over austerity cuts.
Yes. A reminder of the unpredictability factor. He can walk away.
So given the current budget deficit, the finance minister has a really tough job balancing Wilders' demands, fiscal reality, and what the other coalition partners want.
A real juggling act. Competing priorities everywhere.
And the core issue, it seems, coming back from the discussion, is just how hard it is for the parties in this particular coalition to swallow compromises that might upset their base.
Yeah, a lowered tolerance for political pain, perhaps.
Maybe. Which makes these budget talks usually a bit technical, potentially a major flashpoint this time.
It really puts the spotlight on that central question the Ephemeron hosts raised. Are these parties willing to take some hits, some criticism, to keep the whole government stable?
It's high-stakes stuff, the fact these arguments are already sort of public.
Yeah, that itself raises the temperature, doesn't it? Suggests maybe a deeper unease, a less willingness to smooth things over behind closed doors compared to some past coalitions. Could make things rockier.
Definitely something to watch.
Huh.
Okay, finally, the deep dive took a bit of a turn, looking at the opposition. Franz Timmermans trying to re-energize PVDA Groenlinks with a new vision.
Ah, the main opposition party. What's the take there?
Well, the ephemeron hosts sounded, again, a bit skeptical. They saw it partly as maybe damage control, after some recent interviews where Timmermans came across as maybe a bit self-focused.
Managing perceptions.
And they noted that despite public dissatisfaction with the coalition often showing up in polls, the combined PVDA Groenlinks party isn't really gaining huge ground.
Interesting. Why not? Any theories?
The podcast suggested it might be down to their tone, their messaging. Maybe Timmermans' leadership style isn't connecting broadly enough.
So government instability doesn't automatically mean a surge for the opposition. They need a compelling alternative.
Seems so. And they highlighted one specific phrase in the new vision, solidarity with Ukraine and Gaza. Pointed out that could be a tricky area, maybe causing some internal division within the broader left.
Delicate balancing act there, too, on foreign policy.
Yeah. And also, the lack of any obvious successor to Timmermans was mentioned, raises questions about the future leadership, the direction of the party long term. They seem to be navigating their own complex path.
That's insightful. The opposition struggles are just as much a part of the political story as the government's. Uncertainty about their future leadership is a big factor, too.
Right. And then we got to maybe the juiciest detail, Rob Jetton's trip to Argentina.
Ah, yes, that certainly caused a stir.
The hosts framed it as this mix, right? Official duties, he was with the Committee on Foreign Trade and Development Aid, but also a personal visit. His fiancé's family is there.
Okay, so a blend of work and personal.
Yeah, but the controversy, as they laid it out, comes because he didn't fly back with the official group. He stayed on.
And the perception is?
The perception, or at least the question raised, is whether he essentially used a taxpayer-funded work trip to facilitate a personal holiday extension.
Right. And given his party, D66, and their focus on environmental issues, especially flying.
Exactly. That makes it particularly sensitive. The optics, as they say.
Bad optics.
Yeah. The ephemeron hosts made the point that politicians who put their private lives out there, who publicize them, become quite vulnerable when stuff like this happens.
It's that intersection of public duty and private life, always under intense scrutiny, especially when it seems to contradict your party's platform, like on environmental impact.
It's a reminder, isn't it? Personal choices can easily become political fodder.
Definitely, especially in today's media climate.
So there we have it. That wraps up our deep dive into, well, a really packed week in Dutch politics, seen through the lens of that ephemeron podcast.
We've covered a lot of the stick-stuff complexities, those internal coalition fights over pensions, the whole budget balancing act.
And even, yeah, Rob Jetton's travel plans generating headlines.
So what's the takeaway for you, the listener, trying to stay informed? I think it really underlines that constant push and pull in a coalition.
Absolutely, trying to tackle these massive, deep-rooted policy problems.
While juggling internal party disagreements, managing public perception all at the same time. That tension, between long-term goals and short-term political survival, it's just palpable.
It really is. And this deep dive, I think, leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. How much do these internal dynamics, these personal decisions politicians make, how much do they actually end up shaping the big policy outcomes?
Yeah, are they more connected than we sometimes realize from just reading the headlines? Is the political maneuvering inseparable from the policy substance?
Something to mull over, definitely.
Well, we hope this is giving you a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of what's been happening. These are complex issues, always evolving.
They certainly are. And we definitely encourage you to keep exploring any of these topics that caught your interest. There's always more beneath the surface.
Indeed. Keep digging, keep questioning.
Until our next deep dive, keep that critical thinking sharp and keep on learning.